Now in the States, we never got the Toyota Soarer, but Japan has been enjoying the Soarer since 1981. Now when 1989 rolled around, the second generation Soarer was becoming kind of out of date and Toyota needed to update it, so they began designing the new Toyota Soarer in their California design studio. Fast forward to 1991, and this new design had been released in the US under the name of the Lexus SC400. Shortly thereafter, in about mid-1992, it was released in Japan as the third generation Toyota Soarer. Now when it initially hit the US, this SC400 used the exact same engine that was found in the LS400, which had made a huge impact in the luxury sedan market at the time. It was the newcomer to the Grand Touring Coupe market, which was a pretty small market with not a whole lot of options to choose from, and right away it was a massive success, selling almost 20,000 units in the very first year it was offered. It had everything the competition did, plus an elegant design, plus a buttery smooth V8, plus luxury features for days. The huge success of the Lexus SC400 prompted Toyota to build a new version of the SC, which used the engine from the Toyota Supra, and this would be known as the SC300. The Lexus SC300 was launched in mid-1992, and it featured the smaller 3-liter inline-6 2JZ, which was sourced from the Toyota Supra, and a lower price tag than the SC400. You would think that the cheaper version, the SC300, would be way more popular than the SC400, but that was not the case at all, and it sold about half as much in the first year as the SC400 did. At the time, people didn't realize that the 2JZ was some legendary engine which could handle tons of power. At the time, it was just the smaller inline-6, and most people would rather have the bigger V8, which made more power and more torque. Fast forward to 2018, and the SC300 is not nearly as popular as some other JDM cars from that era, but it really should be. In case you hadn't figured it out already, the SC is pretty much mechanically identical to the Toyota Supra underneath. To put it simply, it's basically the poor man's Supra. The 2JZ engine under the hood is sourced directly from the Toyota Supra, as is the manual transmission, which there's not a whole lot of, and the automatic transmission. On top of that, they also share subframes, which means they also have the same suspension geometry. Although the Lexus had a much softer suspension than the Supra, they have the same geometry. Mechanically speaking, the SC300 and SC400 were pretty much identical to the Supra underneath. Unfortunately, there weren't a whole lot of SC300s built with a manual transmission, and only one SC400 was ever built with a manual transmission, and that was built for the president of Toyota North America at the time. Luckily for an SC300, it's pretty easy to swap in a manual transmission because you can just source one from the Toyota Supra and pretty much everything bolts right up. At the time that the 1UZ was out, there was no manual transmission option for any car powered by the 1UZ, which means that there's really no 1UZ transmission. You can just throw in an SC400. Easiest solution is to go with a company who makes adapter plates which allow you to take a Nissan 350Z or KA24DE manual transmission and stick it onto the back of the 1UZ. There are other options to get a manual transmission in an SC400, but it's not nearly as easy as it is to get a manual transmission in an SC300. Although the SC300 got the 2JZ, it's not the 2JZ that has exploded all over the internet. It's not the one that handles like 1,000 wheel horsepower super duper easily. It's a non-turbo 2JZ. Now luckily, it still has a super strong bottom end, so if you want to crank up the power of an SC300, you just need to stick a turbo on it, head studs, better head gasket, and a lot more fueling, and you can easily, like super easily, get 500 wheel out of an SC300. Getting big power out of an SC400 is a little bit more complicated. You can go either an NA build or you can go with like Terminator Cobra supercharger. It's not as easy to get big power out of an SC400, but it can still be done. What doesn't really make sense is why the Lexus SC300 and SC400 aren't super popular with enthusiasts right now. If you go to any car show, you're going to see way more Hondas, way more Subarus, way more anything JDM than a Lexus SC300 and SC400, which is super weird because underneath it's a Toyota Supra and it has all the ingredients to make a really fast car, well-handling car. It has a super nice interior. It has everything that you could ever want in a car, but it's still not very popular. Toyota was known for way over-engineering everything in the mid-1990s, and that's what made the Supra so costly and ended up going out of production. Take that same over-engineering and add in a bunch of luxury features, and that's how you get the SC300. It's super reliable, it can make a bunch of power, it has great suspension, it has everything you could ever want, and it's really over-engineered. Personally, I think the Lexus SC is a killer buy, and that's because it has all the right ingredients to make a really fast tuner car, especially the SC300. It has a 2JZ, it has great suspension geometry, it has the looks, it's a two-door, it has a nice interior, it has everything. And although my Lexus SC400 ended up exploding, I think that they are a fantastic buy, and if you're looking to get into tuner cars, the SC is a great way to go.
Either way, many people are confused about what a 2JZ is and how it's different than a 1JZ. In this short video, we're going to explain the difference between a 1JZ and a 2JZ. As you may have guessed, the 1JZ came before the 2JZ, and it came in a few different forms. Regardless of the engine dressings, it was always a 2.5 liter inline 6 with an 86mm bore and a 71.5mm stroke. We're going to talk about the 1JZ GTE, which is the top of the line twin turbo model of the 1JZ. The 1JZ GTE was equipped with parallel turbochargers, and later engines were equipped with VVTi, Toyota's variable valve timing system. The 1JZ is roughly similar to the 7M GTE it replaced, but without all the cylinder head issues that plagued the 7M GTE. The 2JZ shares most of its components with the 1JZ. The biggest difference is the displacement. The 2JZ retains the 86mm bore that the 1JZ has, but its stroke is increased from 71.5mm to 86mm. This makes the 2JZ a square engine, which means bore and stroke are equal. This provides a better equal medium between low-end torque and high-end horsepower. Unlike the 1JZ, the 2JZ GTE came with sequential turbos, meaning that the power band is much broader. One turbo gives low-end RPM power, and the second turbo comes on at a later RPM to increase power in a very linear fashion. Unfortunately, we can't give you dyno graphs comparing the 1JZ and the 2JZ when modified because it's pretty much impossible to find dyno graphs of each engine modified exactly the same. I can tell you, however, that they respond to modifications nearly identically. The 2JZ, of course, will make a little bit more power and torque thanks to its extra displacement. How well the engine responds greatly depends on the size of the turbocharger. Generally speaking, a 2JZ making around 500 wheel horsepower is going to respond to throttle inputs better than a 1JZ making similar power. This is once again an attribute of that increased stroke of the 2JZ. Contrary to what most people believe, the 1JZ and 2JZ are pretty much equally as strong. Their connecting rods are identical other than the length, and the crank and pistons are pretty much equally strong as well. The reason most people think the 2JZ is stronger is that it can hold up to higher horsepower levels, but they fail to account for that extra displacement. Generally speaking, the 1JZ stock bottom end is good for around 650 to 700 horsepower, and then the stock 2JZ bottom end is good for around 800 horsepower. With some simple math, this will show you that the 1JZ bottom end is good for around 260 horsepower per liter, and the 2JZ bottom end is good for around 266 horsepower per liter. This means that they're pretty much equally as strong. Both of these engines' bottom ends have been pushed way past the numbers I've just quoted, but the 1JZ and 2JZ can reliably push around 266 horsepower per liter on their bottom end. Both are some of the strongest factory engines to ever come in a production automobile. Very few engines in the world can reliably hold up to 1,000 horsepower or more. As far as the sound goes, the 1JZ and the 2JZ sound pretty similar. This is probably due to them being mostly the same. However, the 1JZ's slightly higher redline gives it more of a high-pitched scream. Both engines sound pretty awesome, but I've got to say the 1JZ sounds a touch cooler. To conclude, the 1JZ is marginally better for drifting, especially on a budget. The shorter stroke means it loves to hang out at high RPMs, but it lacks the low-end power due to a short stroke and smaller displacement. It also takes a fairly long time to spool up the turbocharger because of its short stroke. The 2JZ is better for street use. The larger displacement and longer stroke really help out in low RPMs, but the longer stroke limits its reliability when at high RPMs for extended periods of time. The longer stroke, however, means that it can spool up the turbos much faster, making it way better for street use. Be sure to hit that subscribe button if you like this video, and